Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. Before we go on any further, if you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. Still trying to recover my channel from the hack from a couple weeks back. But now onto the matter at hand. Another solo album review of the newest project from JPEGMAFIA, LP. So here's an overly broad statement that's more true than some want to realize. The music industry is not for everyone. And when I say that, I'm focusing specifically on the current state of label machinery, especially in the majors, that so many of us have been told is the natural state of the industry. But in reality seems a lot more like a house of cards filled with inefficiencies, graft, corruption, and barely legal nonsense. Yes, there are some people who are trying to do good work at every stage of the process, and there's the folks who are not aware of the nightmarish intricacies of the system, or those who are aware are just trying to get by. But in the industrial process in which art is commodified and distributed, it's not going to be an environment that's going to work for everyone, especially if you're on the more experimental side of the coin, or you already have a deep underlying skepticism of any hierarchy or system, often for good reason. So I'll be very honest, I'm frankly shocked that JPEGMAFIA lasted as long within the tangled nest of labels as he did, much less have any affiliation with a major like Republic. And I mean that on both sides of the coin here. It reminds me a little of when a larger label tried to sign Death Grips about a decade ago, and while it would lead to a blip of broader popularity, maybe a few more connections within the network, maybe a couple bigger stages, it very quickly became an untenable relationship. Because of course it would. And for someone who wants to be more transgressive and weird and thought-provoking in his content and sound and artistic impulses like JPEGMAFIA does, which for the record for me has led to some powerful moments that didn't always lead to a stronger whole, especially as he explored a more fragmented sound collage approach to composition on recent albums. Hell, I could easily see JPEGMAFIA throwing all the label nonsense aside and just going back purely indie. And indeed, this album comes in two forms. The one where he got the samples cleared and there's a more slightly streamlined version that you can play on streaming, and then the one where it's free on Bandcamp and YouTube and it's being advertised as the version that's more aligned with his proper vision, where he couldn't have gotten some of the samples cleared but just put it out anyway. And that's going to be the one I'm going to be reviewing. And alright, look, I saw all the critical acclaim, but I've never been as on board with JPEGMAFIA's breakthrough projects the past couple of years as so many have, and as I would have liked to be, with my favorite probably still being Black Ben Carson for all of its sprawling nightmare. So for his last hurrah on a major, what did he deliver here? Oh boy, this is the sort of project where I'm almost not even sure where to start, which is a little bit odd in context of the last couple JPEGMAFIA albums, because outside of the EPs, this is easily his most accessible in about 5 years in terms of structured bars and content. But that's the trick with LP. You can engage with it as the blunt but fractured provocation that's been his bread and butter, a giant middle finger and calling card to the industry with which he's finally done, but dig even a little bit deeper and you'll find yourself in a dizzying funhouse hall of mirrors where the provocation actually winds up cutting deeper and becomes all the more revealing. His targets become more varied and actually legit surprising, and you can glean a little bit more insight into the methods that are far less mad and chaotic than they might appear, provided of course you get on his wavelength. And yet for the first time, the album actually really hit that core of resonance for me, where even that his producer tag is a dismissive, "You think you know me? I think I might know enough by now," where this actually clicked for me. Because it's also fucking incredible. Easily one of the best albums of 2021, and one that was a legit shocker all the way down. I did not expect to like this as much as I did. Now, I know the immediate assumption as to why I like this more. It's probably because the rapping feels more structured and focused, and dare I even say accessible. A little bit less fractured and glossy, where at least for me the ideas didn't quite coalesce into more beyond the moment on those last two albums. In other words, you could argue this might have been targeted at a larger audience. It might have been accessible, especially with the proliferation of gunplay and sports references, the occasional flow that leans on trap or more blunt force blown out production, or the Denzel Curry feature on the remix of Bald on the more streamlined streaming version of the album. It makes all the sense in the world. but I'm not sure that's it. For one, the album still has that sound collage approach to composition and flow, where tracks will blur together and then blow apart, and there are definitely moments where it sounds like the production fidelity shifts as wildly as he does. But what I'd argue is that this feels more thematically focused, still fractured and ragged and prone to wild diversions and provocation, but it aligns more closely with his target, that being the music industry at large, or the sort of online trolls that can't handle what he brings to bear as his more hard leftist side shines through, all of which I can't imagine his major label liked all that much. But also more specifically, another indie rap duo that caught me completely off guard wound up in his crosshairs, and even though it seems like they may have squashed the beef, I do want to examine that beef some detail later on. It touches on the themes of the album. It also means that, like his last two projects, there are points where the momentum can flag or diversions that don't quite click for me. The album can take a bit to rev up its intensity, the Young Dolph sampled interlude on 100 feels a little bit like a dead end, and once again it leaves the open question how many of these songs will actually work outside of the context of the whole project. And my answer to that is a hell of a lot more, because the individual songs seem to hit way more effectively, both on this project in terms of production and the content. Some of these can really stand alone. In the former category, look, the reason why the album seems to take a little bit to get going is because the synths that JPEGMAFIA uses are so bright, fluttery, and clear against the shuddering rattle of the percussion that you might think he's actually playing to the more ethereal, hyper-pop adjacent, internet-driven side of the last two albums, which did work really well on the cacophonous Dirty, but felt a little bit underpowered on the weirdly blank-feeling bleeping Nemo. But then end credits goes for a wrestling sample and a borderline rap rock instrumental, and on the offline version of the album, it then flips into an extended Anita Baker and the Winin' sample that reflects a deeper, borderline old-school hip-hop influence on some of JPEGMAFIA's sounds and flows, which doesn't just expand into the shuddering sample flips on the songs that might follow, or the haunted, more Memphis-leaning knock on Are You Happy with the Gangsta Boo sample, or the reggae-inspired flip on The Ghost of Ranking Dread, but also how thoroughly old-school OG was. It was goddamn charming as hell how he flipped that sample and beat. But then there are the instrumentals that feel like JPEGMAFIA stepping into some utterly unfamiliar and experimental territory. The lo-fi rumbling horns, coursing bass, and dank, crushing groove of Rebound, the fractured chime-like twinkles of the rougher percussion and mixing on Dikembe, the roiling bass shudder with the clanking percussion and roiling synths around Tired, Nervous, and Broke, what sounds almost like a vaporwave synth slathered all over the auto-tune crooning of Fire Kissy Face emoji, and the Patricia Taxon-esque synth work on Damn Damn Damn, and then you get the encrusted grit, the blubbery bass, and the metallic Transformers sound effects on Untitled, and most starkly for me, what sounded like a drill sergeant roaring over the jittery acoustics and the quaking bass on Nice, which then breaks into what sounds like a crushing chain gang wallop of BMT. This is where I also feel like I should say something about the mixing and the mastering, which really is all over the place in terms of the vocal placement and fidelity on this album, whether or not certain elements will swamp out the mix. And yeah, I found myself a little bit surprised it doesn't bother me more. I'm not gonna say I didn't notice it. There were definitely more than a few points where I found myself wondering how much more effectively certain songs would work for me if the bass didn't swamp out everything or the vocals might have been better layered. But the greater sense of thematic purpose, just how much more developed the grooves, the hooks, and the melodies have felt, and how every odd production choice has felt so intentional, it left me thinking that this is way more idiosyncratic than outright incompetent, with enough refinement that if your ears are attuned to what JPEGMAFIA is trying to do, you'll appreciate the subtleties in what he's doing, where all the fractures actually come together and make more sense. And that's actually really relevant when you look at the content as well, where JPEGMAFIA might embrace the occasional trap flow and mash up his wordplay full of quotable punchlines. but there's a deliberation that adds some texture to even some of the choppier or more ad-lib moments. What you notice very quickly is that JPEGMAFIA knows exactly how to target his opponents, either in the industry, other rappers, or behind the keyboard, and might as well serve as a textbook on how to bend projections of masculinity and bravado into real weapons, especially as everyone can catch a stray. I love how in stark contrast to so many other rappers using Ike and Tina in questionable throwaway bars, he then takes her side in the clapback on end credits, or how on Hazard Duty Pay, he focuses on black capitalist rappers who put the business above the black, especially when so few of them have lived the life that they profess, and they'll frame it all as a gimmick or a trend, and what happens when those trends run out. JPEGMAFIA blows right past all of that, not just in how he can recognize those who are biting his sound and style, but also how, once again, he'll embrace some sexually charged imagery that will probably make many of his targets legit uncomfortable, and in my opinion that's a positive, not just in how he'll croon an interpolation of Britney Spears' Hit Me Baby One More Time on Thought's Prayer, where there's actually a deeper sense of empathy in how he interweaves a lot of the soulful sampling and flips up a lot of the lyrics and the melody, not the first nor last time he's done so on this album, but also in cuts like Fired Kissy Face Emoji, where some might consider some of the lines too graphic for comfort, especially given where and how he frames himself. It's a projection of masculinity that it's more transgressive, but honestly progressive. My personal favorite comes on Are You Happy, which might be the most deft takedown of keyboard warriors and shit posters I've heard since Shredder's Vanilla Isis, with the amazing line, "All my hate comes from weak-ass men with their weak-ass hoes and their woke-ass friends." And it drills into just how much JPEGMAFIA seems to despise how performative it all feels for them. He wants to get to something real. He enjoys the provocation, I mean, who wouldn't? But his interests feel lived in, eclectic, maybe even uncool in a way that feels authentic and raw, where he'll split Tired, Nervous, and Broke midway through to have an intimate behind-the-scenes chat with Kimbra, and it somehow absolutely works, and it contributes to that exultant feel of so much of this album that he's breaking free, where he can be a howling bruiser, an edgelord horn dog, or a genuine online weirdo with the occasional tender moment that feels earned with less of that cavalier inconsistency that used to annoy me so much. And that leads to the beef that may have already been squashed, but it's worth exploring and dissecting, considering just how much of it shows up on this album and actually illuminates some of its themes. JPEGMAFIA versus Armand Hammer. Yeah, the duo of Billy Woods and Elucid, who also put out one of the best hip-hop albums of 2021 in Haram, and where I previously was not aware of any tension, which apparently came up over some production squabbles over the past couple of years. Probably should have been aware because Elucid actually dissed JPEGMAFIA on Shrines last year, but it's not uncommon for references to go missed with that duo. I'm giving myself a pass. But even beyond that back and forth, what I found so interesting was the ideological friction in between these camps, because it's very real and revealing. And I want to start with how Elucid called out JPEGMAFIA for performative rebel rhetoric, and taking a few pot shots at his veteran discharge and how a lot of the sex references can come across as silly or base. Well, this entire album is JPEGMAFIA calling that line and that bluff, not just in the explosive exodus from the music industry and then living up to his content, but also in highlighting his time in the military placed him way closer to street-level reality than a lot of Armand Hammer's more abstract, academically minded poetry ever has. More to the point, it seems like JPEGMAFIA is one of the few that actually heard and understood Haram from earlier this year, where he specifically targets not just the frequently confusing juxtaposition of liberation ideas with a capitalist framework, but also how it can feel kind of muted, not as revolutionary, less potent in actually challenging those power structures in which they are now seeing a real benefit. Now you can tell Elucid is catching the most of the flack here. There's a few lines at Billy Woods, but they're more strays, kind of reminding me why the duo's chemistry can be a little bit off at points, or there's some tension, given that Billy Woods tends to showcase more rough, feral edges even through the layered poetry, although it comes up more in his solo albums. But thematically, this really does stake the dividing line between those who will critique but compromise within the system and those who will flagrantly reject it, for better and for worse. Honestly got me thinking that JPEGMAFIA and No Name could probably make some fantastic material together in their independent, off-kilter, hard leftist lanes of bars upon bars and militant horniness. And again, that's a compliment. But I'm also aware that the sheer edgelord rapper side of JPEGMAFIA in this album doesn't always stick with me as strongly or feel as balanced against the introspection I really liked on his last two albums. And I'm gonna say it now, it might be the part of this project that ages the worst, because that typically happens with a lot of edgelord shit. But then again, this is me nitpicking on stuff that's prevalent on every JPEGMAFIA record, and it's absolutely the one that showcases the most explosive, colorful, and focused refinement of his sound to date. And yet, for as weird as this thing might get, I'd also argue it's his most accessible in terms of tune, and structured bars, and sheer unbridled bangers. Yeah, probably works at its best as a whole, but in terms of individual compositions, this has some of his absolute best, especially in terms of just outright quotables. And even then, I'd probably still call it transitional. It's the mother of all "I quit" text messages at his label and the industry around him, but it's also one that highlights, without those unnecessary constraints, everything he could probably do with the technician discipline to now pull it off. He's still finding more ways to evolve, and I actually think I'm on board for the ride this time. So 9 out of 10, one of the best albums of 2021, and even though odds are very high that it will not be for everyone, I still recommend you absolutely check this out. It's something special. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, again, I would be extremely grateful. Still trying to rebuild the channel, and we are getting there, just, it's gonna take some time, I know that. Next episode of On the Pulse is coming out soon. I'm sure you all have comments surrounding this video though, so leave them down there below. But if anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in helping my schedule, or potentially getting albums there, or joining my Discord to argue with me on various subjects, link to my Patreon right over there. Once again, don't feel obligated. Tough times, I understand, but if you want to, the option's available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.